Have you ever had a bunch of radioactive waste that you didn't know what to do with? And then you realize there's a massive ocean that you can just dump it all in? Well, me either. But that didn't stop 13 of the largest countries in the world from doing exactly that. Hello, everybody. In today's video, we're going to be going over that time when the world thought it was a good idea to dump a massive amount of radioactive waste in the world's oceans. Dumping waste in places that don't belong is not a new practice by any means. Before modern plumbing, it was pretty common to just use a bucket and throw it out in the street. They did this before they knew about bacteria and the risk of disease, so I'll cut them some slack. But radioactive waste? Come on, how can you think that's okay? From 1946 to 1993, 13 of the largest countries from around the world thought it was a good idea to put radioactive waste on a ship and barge it out to sea and just dump it. An estimated 200,000 tons, or 33,000 elephants, worth of radioactive waste was dumped straight into the sea. This waste was mainly from nuclear, research, and medical industries. They stored this waste, which could be liquid or solid, in different types of containers like metal or concrete drums, or even whole nuclear reactor vessels. The top 5 countries for dumping were number 1, the Soviet Union, with 39,243 TBQ. TBQ is just a unit for measuring radioactivity, and it measures how many atoms decay per second in a material. So 1 TBQ is 1 trillion decays per second. To put that into perspective, the Chernobyl disaster released a little over 12 million TBQ, and global fallout from nuclear weapons tests released a little over 2.5 trillion. The Soviet Union dumped a majority of their radioactive waste throughout 20 dump sites in the Arctic Ocean, but they also dumped a smaller amount throughout 12 dump sites in the Sea of Japan. The Soviet Union was the only country I could find that sent down actual nuclear reactor vessels with spent fuel in them, which is just crazy to think about. I could just imagine a bunch of higher-up government officials coming together and saying, "Sir, what should we do with all this radioactive waste when we're done with it?" "I don't know, just dump it in the ocean, I guess. What's the worst that could happen?" Number 2. The UK dumped 35,088 TBQ and a little over 74,000 tons worth of radioactive waste across 15 sites in the Northeast Atlantic and 18 sites in the British Isles. Not every country reported how many tons or how many containers they dumped, so if I don't mention them, that's why. This ranking is also based off total radioactivity of the containers when they were dropped, based in TBQ. So some other countries may have more tonnage or containers, but that doesn't mean they had more radioactivity. Number 3. Switzerland dumped 4,419 TBQ and 5,321 tons in 7,420 containers across 3 sites in the Northeast Atlantic. Number 4. The United States dumped 3,496 TBQ in a little over 90,000 containers throughout 11 sites in the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico and 18 sites in the mid to northeast Pacific Ocean. I'm very surprised to see the United States in 4th place. It kind of feels like a really bad accomplishment to not be in the top 3. Number 5. Belgium dumped 2,120 TBQ, weighing 23,100 tons, in a little over 55,000 containers throughout 6 sites in the Northeast Atlantic. I'm not going to go over the specifics of the rest of the countries because combined they dumped less than half of what Belgium did, but I will go over them from greatest to least. France at number 6 with 356 TBQ. The Netherlands at number 7 with 336 TBQ. Japan at number 8 with 15.08 TBQ. Sweden at number 9 with 3.2 TBQ. New Zealand at number 10 with 1.04 TBQ. Germany at 11 with 0.2 TBQ. Italy at 12, but it's tied with Germany at 0.2 TBQ. Lastly, South Korea in 13th place. They didn't report exactly how many TBQ they dumped, but they did report 115 containers weighing 45 tons, which is very similar to Italy. An honorable mention to post-Soviet Russia, they dumped 2.8 TBQ, but since they're in the same place as the Soviet Union, I'm not going to put them on the list. The waste they disposed of consisted of liquid waste, solid waste, and even nuclear reactor vessels. The liquid waste could either be dumped straight into the ocean, where it would be diluted by the seawater, or it could be placed in containers. The liquid waste only made up a little over 1% of all TBQ dumped into the ocean, but it's still crazy to think that people would just dump radioactive liquid straight into the ocean and just think, The solid waste was mostly low-level radioactive stuff like resins, filters, or other materials used for decontamination. They would package this stuff in mostly metal containers and fill it with things like cement or asphalt. Some countries didn't do this though, and would just throw containers that weren't meant to withstand the pressures of the ocean, so they would just either implode on the way down or decay once they got to the bottom. There was also unpackaged solid waste, which was mostly parts used in nuclear installments, things like pumps, lids, and steam generators. Low-level solid waste made up a majority of the TBQ dumped, about 45,000, and most of this come from the UK. By far the worst thing to be dumped was nuclear reactor vessels with spent fuel left in them. This made up a little under half of all the TBQ to be dumped. I couldn't find out how many were dumped, but the Soviet Union was the only one I could find to actually dump these, and they dumped all of them in the Arctic Ocean. And almost all of the TBQ that the Soviets dumped was from reactors with spent fuel in them. The reactors with spent fuel were usually filled with a polymer to solidify it, because you got to make sure the nuclear waste you're dumping doesn't get everywhere and hurt anything. The US also dumped reactor vessels, but they didn't contain any spent fuel because we care about what we dump in the ocean. The first dumping occurred in 1946 by the US, about 40 miles off the coast of California. In 1958, some conversations came up at the United Nations Law of the Sea Conference about the dumping of radioactive waste. They basically decided that it was a bad thing and people shouldn't do it, and suggested we do some research on the effects of it. Dumping continued mostly unregulated, but people began to realize this might not be the best idea, so in 1975, the London Convention went into effect, which banned the dumping of high-level radioactive wastes. The convention only banned high-level radioactive waste, which is described as matter exceeding 5 times 10 to the negative fifth power TBQ per kilogram for alpha emitters, 2 times 10 to the negative second power TBQ per kilogram for beta/gamma emitters for half-lives exceeding 1 year but excluding tritium. And lastly, 3 TBQ per kilogram for tritium and beta-gamma emitters with half-lives 1 year or under. Those qualifications are from 1986, so they may have been different in 1975 when the convention was originally written. The dumping of low-level radioactive waste was still allowed all the way up to 1994. However, most countries stopped between the 70s and 80s, but Russia went all the way up until the ban. Apparently, some countries did do some research on where to dump this materials before they just tossed it in the ocean. They would base their dumping sites off things like depth, stability, and current so that the ocean would contain the waste as best as possible. Their idea on dumping radioactive waste in the ocean was that the waste would go to a place where it would most likely not be disturbed. Even with such a noble cause, it was most likely done because this was the cheapest way to dispose of this material. Most of the material they dumped took up a lot of space, and they didn't want to have to store it underground like it was supposed to, so they just dumped it in the ocean. I will give them some props though. They did come up with some clever ways to dispose of this radioactive waste. One of these ways was known as ocean floor disposal, which is basically where they take the waste and put it beneath the ocean floor, where it is very unlikely to be disturbed by anything. The ocean floor is full of water. This water has no flow at all, so the waste moves very slowly through it. This process can take millions of years, which allows the waste to become highly diluted or decayed by the time it reaches open water. Many areas of the ocean floor are also geologically inactive or are very unlikely to see any activity by humans. The water surrounding the waste also absorbs most of the radiation within a few meters. However, this only applies if the waste is well contained. The UK had a pretty cool process of ocean floor disposal, where they would basically put the waste on the seafloor and encase it in cement. I thought this was pretty cool, and it actually taught me that cement can cure underwater, and sometimes it can actually cure better underwater than in air. Putting the waste inside torpedoes and shooting it down to the ocean floor to increase the depth, and also drilling holes were proposed ideas for increasing the depth into the sediment. One of my favorite methods proposed was the disposal in a subduction zone, which is basically a zone on top of a tectonic plate that is being shoved down into the mantle. This would theoretically pull the waste dropped on it into the mantle and dispose of it for good. This plan sounded good on paper, but was never actually done due to concern about if it would actually work or not. Of all the ways to dump radioactive waste in the ocean, The coolest one, if it would have worked, would have actually removed the waste forever, but they decided not to do it because it may have not worked. Like, if you're already dumping radioactive waste in the ocean, why not put it in a place that may or may not remove it permanently? It's kind of a weird time to get picky. So what did all this dumping do to the area? Are there two-headed fishes and giant crabs roaming around? No, not yet at least. In the Arctic Ocean, they collected samples at 4 different dump sites and found elevated levels of radioactive isotopes, but only near the dump sites themselves, not in the surrounding areas. The Northwest Pacific dump sites were found to have elevated levels of radioactive isotopes, but they attributed this to global fallout. So, the Northeast Pacific Ocean and Northwest Atlantic Ocean dump sites of the U.S. were found not to have elevated levels of radioactive isotopes in the surrounding area of the dump sites, but near the dump sites they were found to have elevated levels of radioactive cesium and plutonium. Finally, the Northeast Atlantic dump sites were found to have a measurable amount of leaked radioactive material, but the environmental impact was found to be negligible. So far, the radioactive waste that they dumped isn't seen to be causing too much of an impact. Only time will tell that. But the fact that they did this in the first place just blows my mind. In no world can I see anybody actually agreeing to somebody just dumping radioactive waste into the ocean. Yes, in the grand scheme of things, the total radioactivity of the stuff they dumped is fairly small in comparison to things like global fallout, but still, it's just not okay, man. But that's all. If you liked the video, give it a like and give me a subscribe. But if that's it, have a great day.